Hello, grace and peace to you. My name is Amy Natsky. I welcome you to my channel. Today I begin reading excerpts from Sabina WURMBRAND's book, The Pastor's Wife. Sabina WURMBRAND was a prominent leader in what became known as the underground church in Romania during the Soviet regime. She and her husband Richard endured profound persecution and torture from 1948 to 1964, and then in 1966 came to the States and started the ministry called Jesus to the Communist World, later named Voice of the Martyrs. Sabina and Richard have been given lots of attention through feature film projects over the past 20 years, and these can be helpful in understanding the times that they lived in and the almost unbelievable details of what they endured. But these two, this couple, especially near the end of their lives, were so filled with the presence of God that these kind of pursuits, no matter how well they're done, cannot do justice to who they were as people. You really must meet them in their words. And please look at my text beneath the video because I've given some details concerning how you can do that. The gift of Sabina and Richard is not only their example of endurance in suffering, but how they met their suffering with so much mercy and love for the perpetrators of what was done to them. Nazis, communists, people who betrayed and informed on them, people who failed them miserably. This love did not extend only to their enemies, but to anyone that others would judge as unlovable or unworthy. And their forgiveness was not only forgiveness in the sense of saying, we forgive you and all is clear and the scale is balanced. You'll hear that it always went beyond that. Sabina and Richard were consistently exercising that active, abundant love and kindness and compassion that in those kinds of situations can only come through the power of Jesus living in us. I'm going to read the obituary written for Sabina after she died in August of 2000. This is from the Guardian newspaper of London, and it's written by Michael Bordeaux. Sabina WURMBRAND, who has died of cancer, aged 87, deserved a wider reputation than she in fact enjoyed as one of those who most objectively exposed the repression in communist Romania. Her name is inextricably linked with that of her more famous husband, Pastor Richard WURMBRAND, who came to world attention in exile in 1966 after 20 years in prison. His book, Tortured for Christ, exposed religious persecution under communism, which had been endemic throughout Eastern Europe in the post-war years. Sabina stood quietly aside from the shrillness of this war of words. Instead, she produced her own book, The Pastor's Wife, one of the great testaments to the indomitability of the human spirit and the strength of Christian witness under persecution. For the 20 years following its publication in 1970, world leaders preferred to pay obeisance to the sham of the leadership of Nicolae Ceausescu and his predecessors, rather than absorb the lessons on the essential evil of the regime irrefutably set out in Sabina WURMBRAND's book. One reviewer wrote, "This book is simply one woman's story, a sensitive and unemotional reflection, years after the worst of the pain has passed, by an extremely cultivated, sensitive, indeed humorous mind." She continued to exhibit these qualities throughout her long life in exile. Sabina Oster was born in Chernivtsi, a university city which was in the area of Ukraine annexed by Romania in 1919. Born into a large observant Jewish family, she attended the Sorbonne for 2 years. She later lost both parents and 3 siblings in the Holocaust. She married Richard WURMBRAND, also Jewish, in 1936, and they became Protestant Christians under the influence of Isaac Feinstein, himself a convert, who was to perish under the Nazis. The couple became evangelists, and although under threat, brought several Jewish children out of the ghetto and concealed them. When the Soviets occupied Romania, the couple surreptitiously distributed literature to the Red Army and hid Christians despite the risk of deportation to Siberia. For a year or two, they conducted interdenominational work and built up a church of over 1,000 Jewish Christian members. In February 1948, Richard disappeared into the Gulag. 3 years later, Sabina followed, an experience which fills most of her book. She was conditionally released as part of the post-Stalin amnesty in 1954. Denied work for refusing to divorce her husband, she was there to greet him on his release 15 years later. Following intensive negotiations, they left Romania for Norway with their son Mihai. There, Sabina became known as a moderating influence over her fiery husband, keeping out of the controversies in which he was involved, but underlining the essential truth of the message he wrote and preached. It was in America that they founded a mission called Jesus to the Communist World. Based in California, their extensive travels throughout the free world led to the establishment of branches in many countries, including Britain. For almost 25 years, the international organ of the mission, the Voice of the Martyrs, continued its anti-communist campaign. Then, with the execution of Ceausescu, Christmas Day, 1989, everything changed. Sabina WURMBRAND could return to Romania. Now in her late 70s, she and her husband were received as heroes. Before returning to America, they appeared on TV, and most remarkably of all, they visited Richard's former prison cell to find it used as a repository for their books. The first of my excerpts is from the very beginning. The chapter is called I Meet the Soviet Army. In the summer of 1944, when Hitler's Germany began to collapse, 1 million Soviet troops entered Romania. As the first columns approached Bucharest, we went to meet them on a No. 7 tram. It was the last day of August, cloudless and hot. The guns were silent. Somewhere across the fields, bells were pealing. My husband Richard, as a wartime pastor, had known many Russians in Romanian prison camps. They were by nature instinctively religious, he said, and not less so for 25 years drilling in atheism. We must go out and meet them, said Richard. To speak to Russians about Christ is heaven on earth. When we dropped off at the suburban crossroads, I saw a group of red flags carried by local communists who had come out of hiding to greet the glorious Red Army. They looked at us in doubt. Most people were keeping out of the way of the liberators for the time being, although a big official reception had been prepared in Bucharest. Richard was a striking young man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a confident air that sprung from sureness in his faith. I stood beside him, half his height, smiling, since the war was over now and we would all be friends again. In a patch of shade, 2 or 3 Romanian officials waited. Nervously, they rehearsed some words in Russian. They had come to make the age-old gift to the stranger, a loaf of bread, a handful of salt. We gazed up the empty road, wondering what to expect. The Russians were our allies now, but also a conquering army with known tastes in rape and robbery. In the distance appeared a boy on a bicycle, pedaling for dear life. "They're coming!" he shrilled. "The Russians are coming!" The communists fell into line. Up went the wilting red flags. The officials, who had been discussing plans for celebrations in the capital, stood like sacrificial victims under the hot sun. Roaring motorcycles approached, then the first tanks. From their turrets sprouted red-starred helmets. The communists quavered out the Internationale. The macadammed road shook under the weight of the invaders. Great treads slowed and stopped. The leading tank towered over us, dusty gray scarred steel, a huge gun barrel pointing skywards. As the welcoming speech ended, an officer leant over and took the bread and salt, which was held up. He stared at the black loaf as if it might explode, and laughed. The young sergeant beside him caught my eye. "Well, sweetheart," he grinned, "and what have you to offer?" Few women were out on the streets that day. I said, "I've brought you the Holy Bible." I handed up a copy. "Bread, salt, and Bibles. All we want is a drink," he guffawed and pushed back his helmet. The fair hair glittered in the sun. "Thanks anyway," he said. Metal tracks bit into the road. Engines belched black fumes. The column thundered past. We choked and wiped our eyes. From the tram on the way home, we saw Russians looting. Wine casks were rolled out onto the pavement. Chickens, hams, and sausages were vanishing into sacks. Soldiers pointed excitedly into the windows of suburban shops. Bucharest was then a sad shell of its old self, but to these giant Russian children it was rich beyond belief. Richard spoke to some of them when we got out, but the only answer was, "Where can we find vodka?" So we returned home to make new plans. From these poor souls, God had been stolen in exchange for the promise of an earthly paradise, which can never be fulfilled by human means alone. One thing everyone knew: the Nazi terror was over at last. People hoped that the Russians would calm down and soon go their way in peace. Few guessed that a new and more lasting tyranny had begun. Certainly I did not know that we had just set out on a road that led to prison and would be marked by the graves of friends. I didn't believe Richard when he warned me before we married, "You'll have no easy life with me." In those days we cared very little about God, nor very much about other people, and we didn't want children. We wanted pleasure. Then we became Christians. Richard worked for Norwegian and Swedish and British missions. He became a pastor. He played a role in the World Council of Churches. He preached in churches of many denominations and in bars, brothels, and prisons. I was 31 years old when the Russians came, and by then Richard was a well-known preacher and author. We suffered both as Jews and Christians under the Romanian fascists led by Marshal Antonescu, Hitler's puppet. Richard was arrested 3 times. We were both among a group of 7 Jews court-martialed on charges of holding illegal religious meetings. A Romanian woman came to the police station and told the officer, "You have detained my Jewish brethren. It would be a privilege for me to suffer with them." It was enough. She was arrested and tried with us. God put many such friends on our way. They seemed like angels in the shape of men, working day and night for our good, appearing in every turning in our lives. God has thousands and thousands of such angels, and he uses a multitude of them to make us what we are. Bucharest was lucky. Terrible pogroms occurred in the provinces. In one day at Iași, 11,000 Jews were slaughtered. Perhaps in Bucharest there were the 10 righteous people of whom the Bible speaks as being a reason for saving Sodom and Gomorrah. We heard that 7 young girls had survived in Tassi with the Norwegian missionary, Sister Olga, who had brought them to Christ. How could we smuggle them into Bucharest before the next massacre? Jews were not permitted to travel. A Christian friend in the police had the girls arrested and sent to the capital. We met the train and brought them to our home and safety. Another young man reached the capital from this district with his girlfriend and stayed with us. What help and comfort they all were in years to come, especially the young man. He became my successor as pastor when I was arrested. Where there's a will, there's a way, and we willed this. We could save these girls from the slaughter that threatened. But so many people wished only not to be involved and failed in their Christian duty and allowed thousands who might have been saved to perish. There was no one to rescue the tens of thousands of Jews deported from provincial towns, including my own family who lived near the frontier town of Charnitsky. It was winter. Many captives collapsed in the snow. Others died of starvation. Soldiers massacred the rest. My parents, my brother and 3 sisters, many friends and relatives never came back. Even today, the thought is like a wound. It bleeds whenever it is touched. Jewish history is full of such traumatic events. Remembrance of them is inscribed deeply in the heart of every Jew. This can carry them beyond self to weep with the multitudes from other nations who mourn over similar tragedies. Our only son, Mihai, was 5 years old by the time Nazism was overthrown. He'd taken in much more than a child would in normal times. Fear and death were everywhere. He missed nothing. Our apartment was a gathering place, and every night people came to tell their troubles. He listened and learnt early of cruelty and suffering. Richard taught him, told him stories. Mihai honored his father, who, although always busy with his mission, found time every day to speak and play with him. Once he explained how John the Baptist said that a man with 2 coats should give to him that hath none. "You've got 2 suits, Daddy," said Mihai. "So I have," Richard replied. He'd just bought his first new suit in years. "You can give the new one to old Mr. Ionescu, who always wears that smelly jacket." Richard promised he would, and Mihai went content to bed. He always took what he was told very seriously and drew his own conclusions. He was very attentive to how his father worked on the hearts of others. Sometimes the conversions produced by Richard's work had side results for Mihai. He became a favorite with the converts, who brought him toys and candy. During the war, we had to move to a smaller apartment. Our neighbors in the new block were violently anti-Jewish. This hatred pervaded Romania, and even Christians, particularly Christian prelates, played a role in exciting it. Few failed to succumb to the phobia. In our courtyard were pasted big posters of Corneliu Codreanu, the Iron Guard leader, a symbol of everything anti-Semitic. And Jew was stamped on our identity cards, as on our hearts. We didn't feel very comfortable. But Richard went from neighbor to neighbor, breaking the ice. He had a confidence that souls can be won for Christ, and a trust that was not easily dismayed by worldly cynicism or brutality. He could find the right word about the Savior for different people, or warn about the punishment of God without giving offense. He could charm or cajole, yet be very direct. His blue eyes could look into your soul. Richard went to work strategically, first on our new landlord, then one by one on neighbors. He began by trying to make them laugh. Mr. Parvalescu, on the 3rd floor, exploded. "You Jews have never done a damned thing that's any good." Richard, who was standing in their parlor, simply replied, "That's a fine sewing machine. What's its make? A singer! Hold on. Wasn't that invented by a Jew? Mr. Parvalescu, if you really think the Jews are so useless, you'd better get rid of it." Across the landing from us was waspish, middle-aged Mrs. Georgescu, who raged about those Jews. But soon she was confiding her woes to Richard. Her husband had left her. Her young son was wild. She feared he would catch venereal disease. Richard promised to speak to him. "But even if he was to catch something," said Richard, "these things can be cured now, although the remedy was invented by a Jew." He broke down their prejudice. Then he told them the gospel message. Soon they began to change. We met a new politeness, then affection. Posters of Codreanu were replaced by Bible verses, and in that small block, when hell raged outside, we lived as in another world of friendship and peace. One new friend was a policeman with a motorcycle. He drank and beat his wife until Richard spoke to him and Christ gave him a new heart. Then he took Mihai for rides. A motorcycle was a rarity in those days. Mihai was the happiest of boys. When air raids began, we couldn't leave the city. Jews were not allowed to travel. But the policeman took Mihai out to stay with friends in the country until the worst was over. If they were challenged, Mihai was to give the fine old Romanian name of Jean im Vlad. He was thrilled by the adventure. Mihai heard much about cruelty and suffering, but in this house he knew also great goodness. He was surrounded only by friends, and from their love he learnt many lessons that were of great value to him later. Anutsa, one of my closest friends, called one day for coffee at our flat. Small and fair, pretty and gay, she came from Norway, and she talked like a flowing river. "Oh, these Russians! Have you heard about our new deal with Moscow? They take all our wheat, and in return we give them all our oil. Yesterday I saw a Red Army man with 3 wristwatches on each arm. They take them from people in the streets as if they were collecting bus tickets." She laughed, but for the country it was no laughing matter. The Soviet army looted goods worth thousands of millions of dollars. Then, on orders from the Kremlin, our navy, our merchant fleet, half the rolling stock, and every car was carried off to Russia. The shops were empty. Endless queues waited everywhere. But Stalin said the Red Army would leave when Germany was finally beaten. Perhaps it would be all over soon. "Oh, let's talk about something nice. Sabina, I heard you speak at the Ladies' Guild. What a lawyer the world lost in you." It was beautiful, and your husband's sermon was wonderful too. So much history and art and philosophy, and isn't 2 hours rather long? We in Norway aren't used to such long ones, although for myself I just wish he'd keep on and on. Anutsa loved to chatter. She'd come to collect another pile of our church magazine, The Friend. The fascists had banned it. Now we were all working to put out issues. Briefly, we enjoyed a spell of religious freedom. The dictator Antonescu had been taken to Moscow, then brought back and shot. Orthodox church prelates who would exercise tyranny over Jews and Protestants had lost their absolute dominion. At last we had a democratic government. To please the Russians, communists filled a few posts. Scarcely anyone realized what lay ahead. After all, they said, this is a country of 20 million people. We haven't got enough real communists to fill a football stadium. All through the war we had worked to help victims of the Nazis, Jews in concentration camps, children left parentless by the massacres, and Romanian Protestants who were greatly persecuted under Antonescu. We organized the first relief to Hungarian Jews and to another oppressed minority, the Gypsies. But now a new minority had been created. The hunter had become the hunted. German troops left behind in the retreat had to fend for themselves, and many died. We were utterly opposed to the Nazis. They had killed millions. They had devastated whole countries, leaving cities in ruins. Our friends and relatives had been thrown into their furnaces. But now they were defeated and offered no danger. Most of the soldiers who remained were like ourselves, simply victims of war. They were starving and terrified. We could not refuse them help. People said, "You're taking foolish risks for the sake of murderers." "God is always on the side of the persecuted," Richard answered. It was not only Martin Bormann and co. who were being hunted like animals. It was also the silly boys who had paraded in brown shirts on Sunday afternoons and become soldiers by order. And not everyone was brave enough to prefer death to taking part in Nazi massacres. Anti-Semitism had prevailed among Germans and Romanians, but there existed also small groups who had risked their lives to help Jews. Why hate a whole people because of a Hitler and his many followers? Why not rather love this people for the sake of its saints and the few who resisted the tyrant? The Bible tells us what it really means to be a Jew. The biblical word for Hebrew, ivri, means, etymologically, to stand on the other side. The first Hebrew was Abraham, and he was one in the real sense of the word, standing on the other side. When all men worshipped idols, Abraham worshipped the living God. When others are bent on revenge, on ways of doing more evil than their neighbor, God gives to some the ability to return good for evil. Once, 3 German officers hid in a tiny outhouse in our yard. It was a dark little garage, half buried in snow. We fed them and emptied their buckets at night. We hated their former atrocities. We ourselves had been the victims. But now we talked to them, trying to make them feel less like caged beasts. One evening, when I called, their captain said, "I must tell you something that's on my mind. You know that it is death to shelter a German soldier. Yet you do it, and you are a Jew. I must tell you that when the German army recaptures Bucharest, which it surely will, I'll never do for you what you have done for us." He looked at me strangely. I thought I should try to explain. Sitting down on an upturned box, I said, "I am your host. My family were killed by the Nazis. But even so, as long as you are under my roof, I owe you not only protection, but the respect due to a guest. You will suffer. The Bible says, 'Whoso sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed.' I will protect you as much as I can from the police, but I cannot protect you from the wrath of God." "Humbug," he answered. He patted me on the shoulder. I drew back. His hand had shed innocent blood. He apologized. "I did not mean it badly. I just wondered why a Jewess should risk her life for a German soldier. I do not like Jews, and I do not fear God." "Let us leave it," I said. "We remember a word of God in the Old Testament, 'Give love to strangers, for you too have been strangers in the land of Egypt.'" He seemed puzzled. "That was thousands of years ago. What is it to you if your forefathers suffered in Egypt?" I said, "To God 1,000 years are as one day. Wise men tell us we store the experience of past generations like memory books. In our unconscious are written the events of the past. We don't know them, but they are determining our feelings and our judgments. And secondly, God says with good reason, love strangers, for in the last resort we are all strangers to each other, even to ourselves. "Wait a minute," said the officer. "Jews have committed crimes against the German people and mankind. Honesty makes me tell you this to your face. But you must look on us as men who have committed crimes against the Jews, and you forgive them all?" I answered very earnestly, "Even the worst crimes are forgiven by faith in Jesus Christ. I have no authority to forgive. Jesus can do so, if you repent." The soft crunch of footsteps on loose snow came from the yard outside. I peered out through a crack, but it was only the deaf old janitor from next door. The captain lit one of the cigarettes Richard had found for them. He inhaled and passed the butt to his friend. He said, "I won't say I understand you, but perhaps if no one had this gift of returning good for evil you talk about, then there would never be an end to killing." When I stood up to leave, they rose and gave little formal bows. I put their laundry in my shopping bag and went out. These men eventually crossed the frontier safely into Germany, but many thousands like them were rounded up and died after spending years in Soviet labor camps, together with Russian Christians who might have taught them further. Every German at that time wanted to get rid of his Wehrmacht uniform. How proudly they had once worn those well-cut tunics, the badges and the medals. How hard it was now to accept in exchange the poor civilian clothes we offered. It was at this time that Richard began to bring home Russian soldiers. He was determined to tell them about Christ. Others rightly believed the country should be rid of them. "Do be careful, Sabina," said Anutsa. "What will you do if the two armies meet in your home?" We took care not to let that happen. Richard began by entering Red Army barracks posing as a black market dealer in cheap watches. A group would gather round. After a time, he would lead the talk away from bargaining to the Bible. "You haven't come for a watch," an older man would say. "You want to tell us about the saints." As Richard spoke, one would put a warning hand on his knee. "Talk watches. The company informer's coming." The Red Army was full of them. They spied on comrades and reported all they said. The young soldiers knew nothing about God. They had never seen a Bible or been inside a church. Now I learned why Richard said it was heaven on earth to bring the gospel to Russians. I found some educated men who knew German or French. I told them the creed. It begins with the words, "I believe." It isn't like a party order that tells you what to think. It says that you must become an I, a personality in your own right. You must think for yourselves. An army moves at the speed of the slowest truck, and if men advance in the mass, it will be at the rate of the slowest man. Christ calls you out of the mass. Man's greatest privilege is the right to say yes or no, even to God. It was beautiful to see men awakening to truth. Red soldiers often slept in our spare room. Once 6 stayed on the same evening, all boots and rifles. I had great trouble keeping the house free from lice, but it was the soldiers, rather than us, who were nervous. It was a long time since they'd lived in a house. How happy they were to be away from their noisy barracks for an hour. But that didn't stop their stealing. 2 boys in uniform, with country faces, came to the door. "Do you want to buy an umbrella?" they asked, offering 3 stolen samples. "Ah, but we are Christians," Richard replied. "We don't buy. We have something to sell." He invited them in. I brought them some milk to drink. Then the elder of them, who was fair-haired and hardly more than 20, stared at me. "Why, it was you who gave me the Bible," he exclaimed. In the same moment I recognized him. "You're the sergeant from the first tank into Bucharest," I said. He had the Bible still in his locker. He had read in it and settled a question that puzzled him. Ivan told us over a meal how he had fought his way across Eastern Europe. In his company was a Jew who, like the rest of them, had been brought up without religion. An older man in our unit used to rant at this Jew, "You killed Christ!" The Jew thought he was crazy. He'd been killing people all the way from Stalingrad to Bucharest. How did he know who he had killed? The name of Christ was totally unknown to him. Ivan brought the Jew to our home. Richard told them everything, from Adam to the Revelation. Stalin ceased to be their God. They came often to see us. When his regiment moved out, Ivan left a farewell gift, a shining new electric stove. I looked at Richard. We knew it had not been paid for. "It's beautiful," cried Anutsa. "Just what the Liebmans need." This family had returned from Auschwitz, destitute. We sent them the stove. It had been stolen out of gratitude for being shown the way of Christ. A simple soul's love may show itself in strange ways. If God were really to judge man for all his deeds, scarcely anyone would be saved. How good it was that the blood of Jesus Christ covered even such sins. Richard and his colleague at the Lutheran Church, Pastor Magnus Solheim, started a canteen to feed war victims. Our flat, which was rather a guest house, was always overflowing with friends and strangers. Many were ex-convicts won for Christ by the zealous work in prison of another friend, Millie. We never sat down to luncheon on Sunday with less than a dozen people around the table. Young girls worked with us. They asked advice sometimes about moral questions. One in particular I didn't know how to answer correctly, because it had been my problem too. At the age of 17, I lived in Paris. For the first time, I was free of parental control. I'd been brought up in a strictly Orthodox Jewish family in a small town, hedged about with prohibitions, inhibitions, rules. And now I was up at the university, and the first boy in my life took me out. He wanted to kiss me, and I repelled him. I told him a little about how I'd been brought up. The boy asked simply, "If you believe in God, wouldn't you say that the same God made the hands and the lips? And if I can touch your hand to mine, why is it wrong to touch your lips or to embrace you?" Teachers, parents, no one had warned me of this question. I had no answer to it, and the boy was very appealing. So I altered my convictions to suit the gay life of Paris. An atheist is free to kiss and to behave as she likes. His eyes and his hands were the brokers of sin, and as for my eyes and my heart, they were his handmaiden. But conscience won't be stifled forever. The problem nagged. Why should a girl keep herself pure? It is at the heart of many moral codes, but what purpose does it serve? I did not know. Only many years later I learned the answer. A pastor's wife doesn't usually discuss sexual questions. Still less is she expected to experience such temptations herself. But both pastors and their wives are human. And in the past, Richard and I had led such thoughtless, self-indulgent lives. We were converts, insecure about some things which lifelong Christians took for granted. Sexuality is vital to human nature, and in our marriage the stresses it caused were sometimes great. Richard was so good, so handsome, and so brilliant that I feared all the adulation he was given might turn his head. Many girls fell in love with him, and to one he was much attracted. I must say she was lovely. It was a joy to look at her. I saw that Richard was being torn in two. Quietly I tried to help him. Sin is often the result of occasion. It is a wife's duty to stay close to her husband in crises like this. He said nothing, but one day, as he played a Christian hymn on the piano, he came to the words, "I need you every hour," and all the strings of the piano seemed to sing together, and he wept. I put my arms around him and said, "Richard, you're not an angel. Don't take it so hard. You're only a man. These things will pass." They did pass. And when I was left alone for 14 years after Richard's arrest, temptations came to me also, and to some I nearly yielded in my loneliness. Then I understood him better.